We must move on to issue 3. What's in a name?
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
President Trump pushed back against a challenge that his description of the coronavirus as the quote-unquote Chinese virus is racist. But the battle over what to call the virus isn't going away. The Trump administration is increasingly aggravated by Chinese state propaganda, which is spreading rumors that the virus originated with American soldiers. The president says such false and malicious accusations require China admit its responsibility. And the facts do suggest China did indeed conceal early reports on the virus's infectiousness.
Is President Trump right to point blame at China for how this pandemic has evolved? Susan.
Well, his rationale is to just show where it came from, not just because, it started in China, therefore we can just point the finger and be angry. But it's about the way China handled the situation from the beginning, the way they silenced people who tried to warn the world about this. That's pretty scary. And the way they tried to play down the threat, which slowed down our understanding about how dangerous it is. And I also think part of Trump's motive here is he often will kind of push back against criticisms about how he has handled it. And he's trying to make clear that China knew about this and the seriousness of this much earlier, didn't do anything about it. Don't forget that there were some liberals calling it the Trump virus, blaming it all on him somehow. So it doesn't surprise me for him to come out and say, look, let's just remember where this started and why it got as bad as it did so quickly.
Well, it may not surprise you, but this president always likes to pick somebody to blame. And China has done some despicable things, but they have gotten on top of this and they've turned it around. And
Are you sure about that?
Well, maybe.
You believe what's coming out of the Chinese
one quick data point, and then we'll go right back to Eleanor. Starbucks in Wuhan just opened back up again. So that tells you a little bit of something as it relates to China. But I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, they've taken steps that we really can't take in a democratic society, but they seem to have clamped it down. And they're using that to portray themselves as leaders on the world stage. So there's some geopolitical stuff going on here as well. But this is the COVID-19 virus. This is the coronavirus. This isn't the Chinese flu.
Clarence, let me ask you a question. With respect to the concern as to how China handled this, just going on a related but a little bit of a separate track, there has been some concern about how China handled it very early on, particularly for the doctor, the young doctor who was in Wuhan, who was trying to spread the word about what was happening. Unfortunately, despite the fact that he was young and healthy, he died from this virus. Right. Is some criticism in that regard just as it relates to China's early handling of this, and is that relevant to the crisis?
Absolutely. We haven't had death or jailings blamed on President Trump so far, at least. You know, he was just indifferent, too indifferent to the problem early on, and once he came around to it, then was when he was looking for someone to blame. Yeah, this is the way China operates, unfortunately, and not always. That's why we've been able to operate with great success in our trade, which President Trump has never been satisfied with either, but that's a separate issue. Do you believe that the numbers that indicate this has peaked out in China? Because they're reporting this to the world.
Roaring back.
Let's go to Suraj.
The tough thing here is that what do you actually trust coming out of China? And that's I don't know. And I think we should rely more heavily on what's coming out of South Korea than we should ever rely on what's coming out of China. The Chinese government has been waging a propaganda war against the United States by overly suggesting that the U.S. military started the coronavirus. And I think Trump should continue to push back on it, remind the world that it was the Chinese who failed in this regard, tried to cover it up, and silence their critics who were trying to warn the people around the world.
Let me go to Susan. Let me go to Susan with a quick question. How do we explain the dramatic difference of results in South Korea? I mean, certainly testing had something to do with it, and Suraj talked about it a little bit, but when you look at it globally, obviously China had an unfair advantage because they can imprison 100 million people at a moment, but what are some lessons abroad in terms of how we might be able to push through on this?
Well, they clamped down fast, and they seem to have the equipment necessary to deal with it more quickly, but then that is easier to do in a smaller country. You know, America is made up of 50 states, and the states run their own health systems, generally speaking. We're not really, the federal government doesn't have the stockpiles. They never did to deal with something like this. They wouldn't have had it under the Obama administration either, Eleanor. So I don't think you can say that in the United States that we did such a poor job, and that's why we're now. These are two different countries, different dynamics afoot with how the government's operating.
Final brief word to Eleanor.
Well, South Korea is the model, obviously, and not China. In 2005, November of 2005, President George W. Bush drafted a strategic plan to fight pandemic influenza. He asked for $7.1 billion. That has not been fully funded, but that strategic plan, I went back and looked at it, and it was to have enough supplies and enough research that once a strain is found, that you can develop a vaccine within 6 months. We're now taking things seriously that we should have taken seriously, much more seriously, quite a long time ago.
I will.
President Obama's pandemic.
I will just.
Right.
We've run out of time, but I will say that hopefully, with this era of bipartisanship, we'll be able to see some things change rapidly here in Washington.